Imagine a war that is destroying cities, disrupting oil supplies, trapping ships, and threatening the global economy. Now imagine that thousands of kilometers away, another country is watching very carefully. It isn't rushing soldiers into the conflict. It isn't firing missiles. It isn't declaring war. It is waiting. That country is China, and that raises a strange question. Could China actually benefit from the Iran crisis? At first, the answer seems obvious. China should be one of the biggest victims. China imports huge amounts of oil from the Middle East. A large share of that oil normally travels through the Strait of Hormuz. If the strait remains disrupted, Chinese factories, transportation, airlines, and consumers all face higher energy costs. So why would China be a winner? Because geopolitics isn't always about who wins the war. Sometimes, the biggest winner is the country that gains the most influence from what happens after the war. And the Iran crisis could give China exactly that opportunity. To understand why, we first need to understand what happened. The current conflict began with major U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iran in February 2026. The fighting quickly escalated. Iran responded with attacks across the region, while the United States increased military pressure. One of the biggest consequences was the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. A huge amount of global oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes through it, and most of those energy supplies are heading toward Asian economies. That means countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea are directly exposed. By August 2026, shipping through the strait remained heavily disrupted. Iran claimed control over the waterway, while the United States claimed it could control maritime movement. The result was uncertainty. Ships became more reluctant to enter. Insurance costs increased. Alternative routes became more important, and oil prices remained under pressure. But China had something many countries didn't have: time. For years, Beijing has been building large oil reserves and diversifying its energy suppliers. China buys oil from Russia, Iran, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. It has also invested heavily in pipelines, infrastructure, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and other alternatives to imported oil. So when the crisis hit, China wasn't completely dependent on the next tanker arriving through Hormuz. It could use its reserves. It could reduce purchases temporarily, and it could shift toward other suppliers. That doesn't mean China is safe. Far from it. China remains one of the world's largest oil importers. A prolonged disruption would hurt the Chinese economy. But this is where the geopolitical calculation becomes interesting. China doesn't necessarily need Iran to defeat America. In fact, Beijing probably doesn't want the complete collapse of Iran. What China wants is stability without giving the United States unlimited influence. And that brings us to China's biggest opportunity: diplomacy. For decades, the United States has been the dominant military power in the Middle East. American bases, American warships, American alliances, American security guarantees. China has taken a different approach. Instead of trying to dominate the region militarily, Beijing has focused on building economic and diplomatic relationships with almost everyone. China has strong ties with Iran, but it also has major relationships with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and other Gulf states. And China has already demonstrated that it can use those relationships. In 2023, Beijing helped broker the restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia after years of hostility. That was a major diplomatic achievement. China wasn't simply choosing one side. It was positioning itself as the country capable of bringing rivals to the same table. And the Iran crisis gives Beijing another opportunity. The United States is using military pressure. China can emphasize negotiation. Iran needs someone it can communicate with. The Gulf states need someone who can help prevent the conflict from spreading. And China has relationships with both. Beijing has repeatedly called for de-escalation and negotiations during the crisis. But China's strategy goes beyond diplomacy. There is another potential advantage. America is being pulled deeper into the Middle East. That requires military resources, warships, aircraft, missile defense, intelligence, diplomatic attention, and enormous amounts of money. But America's biggest long-term strategic competitor isn't Iran. It's China. For years, Washington has been shifting its attention toward the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, the South China Sea, Japan, the Philippines, semiconductors, supply chains, military technology. But every additional month of conflict in the Middle East creates another strategic demand on Washington. China doesn't have to attack America to benefit from that. It simply has to watch the opportunity cost. And there is another area where China could benefit: energy. The Iran crisis could accelerate China's long-term effort to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. oil. Every time Beijing sees an energy choke point disrupted, the lesson becomes clearer. Energy security is national security. That means more strategic reserves, more pipelines, more alternative suppliers, more electric vehicles, more renewable energy, and less dependence on a single maritime route. And if the conflict expands across the Gulf, the economic consequences could become enormous. So China isn't hoping for endless war. Its ideal outcome is very different. A ceasefire, a negotiated settlement, a functioning Iran, open shipping routes, stable oil supplies, and a United States that has spent enormous resources in the region. If that happens, China could walk away with something extremely valuable: influence. Because the real competition isn't necessarily about who controls Iran. It's about who shapes the world after the crisis. If America remains the dominant military power, and China becomes increasingly important as an economic and diplomatic power, then the Middle East could become another arena where the global balance slowly shifts. And this is why the Iran crisis matters far beyond Iran. The war is disrupting oil. It is changing shipping routes. It is forcing countries to rethink energy security. It is testing America's alliances. And it is giving China another opportunity to present itself as an alternative center of global power. So, is China really the biggest winner? Not yet. China is taking serious economic risks. But China doesn't need to win the war. It only needs to emerge from the crisis with more influence than it had before. And sometimes, in geopolitics, you don't have to win the battle to win the game.